And this is Tim Fuchs with the National Council on Independent Living. Thanks so much for joining SILCnet's newest webinar, Leading Statewide Strategic Planning. Today's webinar is being presented by the ILNet Training and Technical Assistance Project for SILs and SILCs. ILNet is operated through a partnership among ILRU, NCIL, and April, with support provided by RSA at the U.S. Department of Education. I'm really happy to have Ann McDaniel and Brad Williams with us, and I want to thank them for their patience bearing with us through this morning or this afternoon. Ann, of course, is the Executive Director of the West Virginia Statewide Independent Living Council, has presented many times with SILCnet, and is also on Nichols' Board of Directors. Brad is the Executive Director of the New York SILC and has also presented with us many times. And they presented this webinar originally a few years ago and have given it some updating, some refreshing, and I know from having done it with them then that you guys will enjoy this. It's a great overview of strategic planning for SILCs, and without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ann to get us started. Ann?
Thank you, Tim. I was going to begin with just the introduction to this training and the objectives for this training, and primarily what we're hoping to provide for you is an understanding of the difference between the processes that you go through for your state plan and the other strategic planning that you probably ought to be doing, and things you can do through both of those processes to be effective. So our objectives include differentiating between a SILC strategic plan process and SPIL development, describe the effective strategic planning that supports inclusion in all processes and full accessibility of meetings and materials, describe effective processes for collecting and synthesizing input and setting priorities, and then to describe strategies that will engage, support, and follow up with stakeholders to ensure successful implementation of your strategic plan. Next slide, Tim. So, a few questions to consider. Have you ever had any of the following situations? Have you had difficulty recruiting new members for your council? Problems meeting a quorum when you have meetings? Delays or setbacks with negotiating budgets and contracts? Difficulty with your cash flow? Lack of organizational goals outside the SPIL? Inability to respond to crisis situations? Or the need to lay off or downsize staff? Next slide. You need to be proactive. These problems occur usually because you are reacting to situations instead of anticipating situations and being prepared for them. While writing the SPIL is your primary responsibility, you also have organizational needs. So the solution, we believe, is that you need to define your organizational needs using strategic planning methods. Next slide. So we're really going to talk about two aspects of strategic planning for SILCs. One is SPIL, State Plan for Independent Living Development, and the other is SILC Strategic Plan Development. Next slide. So you might be thinking, isn't the SPIL a strategic plan? Well, yes, it is. It should be. But the SPIL is a plan for independent living in your state, not for your SILC. It works toward building the IL network. A SILC strategic plan is specifically to achieve the mission of the SILC and to support the growth and development of the SILC as an organization, depending on how you're organized. It also directs the work of the SILC outside the SILC's responsibilities for the SPIL and the duties and authorized activities in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, because those things have changed for us, and we're going to talk about that. Next slide. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act has had an impact on the kind of planning that SILCs need to do because of the changes. But specific to the SILC, I wanted to highlight for you the changes to SILC duties. First, we still develop the SPIL, but we don't develop it jointly with the DSU anymore. We develop it with the Centers for Independent Living. And the duty of coordination with the State Rehab Council and other councils is no longer a duty, it's an authorized activity. So in addition to our duties now, there's a section on authorized activities that give us a lot more leeway, a lot more elbow room with what we're allowed to do. And first under that is working with the centers to coordinate independent living services for people with disabilities with other groups. We also, under our authorized activities, have conduct resource development to support SILC activities and or IL services by the centers. And then the last is the catch-all, and it's kind of clever. Perform such other functions consistent with the purpose of this chapter and comparable to other functions described in this subsection as the council determines to be appropriate. So if you look at the purpose of Chapter 1 of Title VII, that gives us a lot more opportunity to do things that are going to be useful to the IL community in our states. Next slide. So then how does WIOA affect SILC planning? Well, it's made some changes to the state plan process. The SPIL is now developed by the SILC and the centers. It is signed by the SILC chair, at least 51% of the center directors in your state, and the director of the designated state entity. And this is a point where I should point out that the designated state entity is not necessarily the state agency that has been your DSU. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. One of the things you have to do in your state plan is to identify who the designated state entity is going to be. So you probably need to start thinking now and having conversations with your centers about the relationship you have with your DSU, and do you want them to continue to be the entity in your state that's designated to receive those Part B dollars? Or do you have another state agency you have a better working relationship with, or is a better fit for whatever reason that you need to be communicating with about the possibility of them being your designated state entity? And then also your SPIL planning process needs to include how the SILC is going to accomplish its duties and authorities. So the second piece then that can be affected by WIOA is SILC strategic planning itself, not the state plan, but a strategic plan for your SILC. And you would coordinate organizational strategies in that strategic plan with the duties and authorities addressed in the SPIL. So you got to be looking at both and planning for both and coordinating both of those plans. Next slide. So the SPIL is a strategic plan, assesses the needs of people with disabilities and gathers input. This is your analysis part. Getting out there, talking with people, finding different ways to gather input from people with disabilities around your state about what their needs are, so that you can be sure that you address those as you develop your plan or figure out what you're going to do. You can't address them all probably. Then it also includes the goals and objectives and how the funds will be used to address those needs. So you figure out what you can do, what your goals are, what objectives you have that you want to use funding for to try to address the needs of people with disabilities around your state. And then it also needs to include input and feedback from others. But the SPIL is a time-limited 3-year plan, and it's for the state, and it is not specifically for the SILC. So, next slide. If you're going to look at strategic planning for the SILC, in addition to the SPIL process, let's talk about why you might need that. First of all, the SPIL addresses statewide independent living needs, which may include the SILC to some degree, but not in a comprehensive way. Even though there is a SILC resource plan in the SPIL, it usually addresses your basic operation, your resources that you need to accomplish your SILC duties. If there's other things that your SILC wants to be doing and has the authority to do, and depending on how you're organized, that can be narrow or very broad, strategic planning specifically for the SILC will help you identify organizational development and longer-range needs of your SILC as an organization. And it will help you to prioritize key issues that aren't discussed during the SPIL development process and allow for other logistical planning related to committees, resources, other activities that if you're a nonprofit SILC, there's a lot of things you can do as a nonprofit that aren't part of your duties or your authorized activities as a SILC. So you'll have to figure out ways you're going to do those. Through strategic planning is how you can do that. Next slide. So you get to make a plan for planning. I love a plan for planning. First, you want to decide who needs to be involved in your planning process when you're doing a strategic plan. Who all is going to be at that table? Identify the stakeholders that you want to gather input from. And those stakeholders can be other entities that you work with, including your DSE. They can be people with disabilities. They can be providers, whoever you decide your stakeholders are. You have to decide what methods you're going to use for gathering input. And that can be public meetings, that can be surveys, that can be focus groups. There's lots of ways to do that. You have to decide what your planning process is going to be to develop your strategic plan. And you have to find a time and a place for the strategic planning to occur without interruptions, which usually means don't do it in your office. Don't do it in somebody else's office. It needs to be more of a retreat atmosphere. You need to be away from your daily responsibilities so you can focus on the strategic planning tasks. Next slide. My voice is gravelly today. I apologize. I'm sipping water. So what kind of plan do you need? What you want and need may vary depending on the structure of your SILC. If you're a nonprofit corporation, you might have a much broader plan than your SILC responsibilities. If you're an informal organization supported by the DSU, your plan might be more focused on how to be more effective as a SILC. And if you're organized in other ways, if you have some other kind of structure for your SILC as a body, you can have other needs for a plan and what it ought to address. The second part is your mission and your vision affect the detail and the time frame for the plan. Missions and visions tend to be very long-range things. So you're going to be looking at what are the steps that will get you there someday, and what is it that you want to try to accomplish within the time frame of your strategic plan. What do you want to accomplish? What you want to accomplish, will impact how long it will take and the detail of the planning. So if you're going to save the world, you're going to have a bigger, longer plan. If you want to, say you're not organized as a nonprofit SILC, but you want to be, maybe your plan is going to get you through that process. You have options. Next slide. Is a facilitator necessary? Probably not. It's probably not essential, but it's definitely recommended. An outside facilitator can make a big difference in how your process goes. They can provide expertise in directing the strategic planning process. That allows all SILC members, staff, and stakeholders to fully participate in the process if none of them have to be the one facilitating. And they also, an outside facilitator can provide you with impartial direction through the process and mediate stressful discussions because they are outside and they don't have any skin in the game, so to speak. Next slide. Resolving disputes, and there honestly probably should be disputes. If you sit down with a group of people to do a strategic plan and everybody agrees on everything through the whole process, somebody's not being honest. So if you do have disputes, you need to identify the areas of agreement. What is it that you do agree about, that everybody's on the same page about? Identify your common goals. Are we all trying to get to the same thing? And then allow for negotiation and give and take on how to get there. How are you going to accomplish the goals? There's usually not only one right way to do it, and the whole point of a process is to identify all the ideas and decide which is the best process that you want to use to get to where you're trying to get to. Having a facilitator to mediate the discussion when you're resolving disputes really can help you reach a resolution. Next slide. Q&A.
Okay, thanks, Ann. So we're going to take our first Q&A break here. Okay, I see a few on the phone, so let's start there. We'll get your line unmuted, and caller, you can go ahead.
Okay, it's Rebecca Traylor from the Alaska SILC. My question is to do with the DSE. Who chooses what entity we assign to be the DSE?
The assignment of the DSE is part of the state plan process. So it's the SILC and the Centers for Independent Living who develop the state plan, and you guys are the ones who need to decide who your DSE is going to be. Obviously, your DSE has to be willing to fulfill that role, and that's why they have to sign off on the state plan to say, yes, we are willing to be the DSE. They're not signing off that they agree with everything in the plan. They're signing that they agree to receive the federal money and serve as the DSE. But the SILC and the centers are the ones who sit down and figure out who it ought to be, communicate with that state agency to ensure that they are willing, because they're going to have to sign the state plan saying that they're willing. But it is totally within the state planning process now, which is the sole responsibility of the SILC and the centers.
I like it. Thank you very much. I just wanted that point of clarification to make sure I heard right.
Sure.
Okay, thanks.
I'm Mary Evilsizer, and I'm with the SILC in Nevada. And my question dovetails with the first question. The decision about the DSU, is there a deadline for submitting it, or is it done in the future with the state plan? What's the process going to be for that? And more importantly, what's the deadline?
We don't know. Until the ACL promulgates new regulations for the independent living part of WIOA, we don't have any guidance specific to that yet. I would anticipate that we'll be writing a new state plan at some point, and they will give us guidance on how and when to do that and what the deadline is, because within that state plan is where the DSE is identified. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right, I'm going to switch to questions from the web now. Let's see. First question comes from Pam Taylor, and Pam would like some clarification. And she says, how can you say that the DSE is not involved in the planning if they have to sign off on the SPIL? Could you clarify that?
I hope. Under the law, the DSE is not one of the required partners in developing your state plan. But in practice, you can involve whoever you want to involve. And depending on the level of involvement the DSE wants and the working relationships, it would be perfectly appropriate to involve them in that. But understand that their signature on the state plan is not like your current DSU signature on the state plan, where you jointly developed it and agreed upon it and signed it and submitted it. They're signing on saying, yes, we are going to be the DSE for this plan, and we will receive the federal funds and follow the plan to distribute them. So it's a little bit different role than your current DSU. And all the details of how that's going to work, we don't know yet. But that's the kind of thing that's going to have to be addressed in the regulations and the guidance that we'll all be receiving from the Administration on Community Living and the Independent Living Administration.
Great. Thanks, Ann. And as Ann mentioned, too, through the ILNet project and also through Nickel, we'll be sharing every single thing we can put together. So there's a lot of unanswered questions now. But for Nickel members, we're having a call next Tuesday, and with all of as much information about WIO as we have now. And then just stay tuned, because we'll be incorporating all this information into a number of trainings over the course of the next year as we find out information and the transition continues. Okay, I'm going to go to slide 9 here, which is the subject of the next question. So Pam asks on slide 9, is the first bullet about assessing need referring to a CNA?
A CNA?
Comprehensive needs assessments.
It can be a comprehensive needs assessment. It's up to the SILC and the centers, when you're developing your plan, to figure out what kind of assessment you're going to do. It could be a comprehensive needs assessment. It could be an assessment of people with disabilities in areas that aren't served by a center, because you're looking at the possibility of developing a new center. Whatever it is that you're going to be going through in your state plan process might guide what kind of a needs assessment you want to do or you need to do. But it's up to those who are responsible for developing the state plan to figure out how they're going to do, how they are going to assess the needs of people with disabilities in your state or whatever part of your state that you're trying to deal with.
Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next question comes from the folks at the Michigan SILC. They're wondering, if we currently have 2 DSUs, could we reduce that to 1 DSE?
I would think yes. As I said, we don't have regulations and guidance yet, but the law requires a designated state entity. So I would think that the answer to that could be yes. And as we get more guidance, we'll know better what we need to be doing. But I do think you guys need to start having conversations, at least with your Centers for Independent Living, about the relationship you have with your current DSU, and does that work? Is there another entity that you think could serve this role better for you, or that is a better fit? Start having those conversations now, so that when we get guidance about what we have to do, you're in a better position to proceed quickly with that.
Okay, good. And the final question from the web that I see now, before we go back to the phone, is from Velja. And Velja's wondering, can we assume that the governor needs to also be in agreement of the DSE?
That's probably going to have a lot to do with how the processes work in your state. And it's hard to answer that without knowing what the guidance is going to be from the feds. But I know that state to state and territory to territory, there are a lot of differences in the way the government works and the kind of authority that state agencies have to even enter into an agreement. So that's probably going to vary greatly depending on how things work in your state. But obviously, that's going to be something that you have to look at, and that's all the more reason that you need to start having conversations amongst yourselves now, so that you don't get hung up on those kinds of details at the last minute while you're still trying to decide who would be a good DSE. I would start looking into those things.
Okay, good, thanks. All right, I see one question has come into the phone queue, so caller, will get your line unmuted, and you can go ahead.
Hi. Is there a default DSE? For example, if our DSU decided they didn't want, but we didn't have another department, is there a default one?
A default?
Yeah.
Not that I am aware of, but again, that may be something that we'll get guidance about. At this point, all we really have is what the law says, and the law says in the state plan you have to identify who the DSE is going to be. So if there's going to be a default, they haven't told us yet.
Thanks.
Okay.
And you know, we're having a changeover in even where the money is going to come from. So at this point to say what the default might be is hard to say, because the DSUs that we have been having are under a different department than we're going to be under now. So it's, you know, we're anxiously awaiting a little more guidance.
Okay. Thanks, Ann. Okay, we've got one more question in the audio queue that I see. Caller, go ahead.
Yes. I know that this is Will Miller from the North Carolina SILC.
Hi, Will.
Hi, Ann. I know that some states have established their SILC by statute. North Carolina is not one of them, but I think Idaho is an example where the SILC is established by statute. It's not a state agency or under a state agency, but an autonomous entity within state government. And this is just a question that I'm curious about. Is it possible for a SILC that is established in that manner to also be named the designated state entity?
Oh, I don't know. I know that with the SILC in Idaho, they have spending authority within the state, so it makes it seem like that might be a possibility. But when they give us regulations and guidance, they may say that's not an option. So I don't really know. My SILC, for example, it's clarified in state code that we're going to be the nonprofit that has been functioning as the SILC. But we don't have state spending authority. So it's very different from the way the Idaho SILC is established in state code. And again, you know, that varies a lot from state to state. But I don't know whether the feds would let us do that or not. That might be a good question to ask, though.
I'm curious because in North Carolina, not to get too much off track, but in North Carolina we are established by executive order that expires in 2016. So we'll be looking for ways to sort of lengthen the period of time that we're recognized as the SILC. And if the SILC can be named as a designated state entity, that might be something that the council would want to look into. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. That's the last question that I see for this Q&A break. So Ann, I want to thank you so much for walking through that. At this point, I'm going to click over to slide 16 and turn the call over to Brad Williams to walk us through the New York process. Brad?
Thank you, Tim. Okay, the SILC Organizational Snapshot Assessment Tool. I'm going to call this exercise number 1. I'm going to renumber a couple of the exercises. Western New York Independent Living, which is located in Buffalo, New York, formerly the RRTC and IL Management, and those are the Rehabilitation Research Training Centers, created the organizational snapshot for SILCs and also the SILs, collects important organizational information about SILCs as well as compliance data, helps to expose areas that need addressing, strengths and weaknesses, what could be referred to a committee for work, in need for potential resources, identifies key information going into a strategic planning process. Next slide. The snapshot takes a picture of how a SILC exists today. this strategic planning tool is divided into 9 management categories: organizational culture, administrative management. They have it as physical plant management, but, wouldn't it be nice if SILCs had physical plants? But, basically our offices: governance board, financial management, human resource management, program and services, community relations, and a sample SILC budget. Overall, it allows you to examine how the SILC is doing in each of these areas. Next slide. In terms of a process, begin at least 2 months prior to a meeting with facilitator. Share results of completed snapshot with full council in advance of meeting. Allow people to review the information to identify gaps, potential goals, and remember, not all members are equal in terms of time and experience. Apply a timeline, say 5 years, to be able to address issues, view progress, and provide for turnover of council. Then compare current snapshot to a new one in 5 years. Next slide. Need for external input. External information should be gathered about the SILC. External perceptions and realities could reflect internal perceptions and realities, maybe. More likely will give you a better understanding of the differences, how your organization is viewed by partners, the public, and stakeholders. We know we strive to achieve diversity on our councils, which should reflect a wide viewpoint, but you should still, get that external, input. It matters. You shouldn't go, into such a process without finding out what other people think, about you as an entity. Formats for gathering input, public comments, open forum if available. We have this available to us. Focus groups, facilitated discussions, survey results, needs assessment results. I've found that focus groups and survey results are probably desired going into a planning process. They're best connected and could work out well, but use what you have available. Next slide.
So we plugged in this Q&A session after Brad's brief intro on the process just to check in and see if you all had any questions about that overview. So I imagine this will be brief, and that's fine. But if you have
Tim,
a question,
let me add to that this is like the preliminary step to the process, and that's why we did this, because rather than go through the entire process, this is like the background work that has to happen, before engaging in the full, strategic planning process. So we felt that it was just good to get some, or have the possibility of having some questions and answers on this first part of the process.
Good. Thanks, Brad. Okay, I don't see any questions on the phone, and I don't see anybody typing. So, but again, we will have another Q&A session at the end of Brad's full section before the end of the call. So no worries. I'll go ahead to slide 22, and Brad, you can continue. Excuse me.
Right, and what I'll add is, the SILC organizational snapshot, just like the SIL organizational snapshot, is a tool. It's an assessment tool. It's not perfect. It's what you use it for your purposes, but it will allow you to fill in the information and get a picture of what your SILC is and where it's at today, okay, what you use for comparative purposes, and you see where your gaps are at. And that allows you to see, what might be working and where you might have some needs. And the external input is important because you want to know what others are thinking. And that is information that you need to gather ahead of time before going into this next part of the process. So, the New York experience. Basically, you conduct the SILC snapshot and share findings. obtain the external input, conduct strategic planning session, and share materials in advance. We use Peter Drucker self-assessment tool exercises and Alfred Humphrey SWOT analysis, which I'll describe in the upcoming panels, and then prioritize important elements in a strategic plan, priority goals. This is the structure, and I'll explain it. Next slide. So exercise number 2, Humphrey SWOT analysis. SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. The assessment provides a quick overview of organizational dynamics, helps to identify strengths and opportunities from which to build, identifies weaknesses and potential threats, and determines if the threats are real and controllable or uncontrollable. Issues and goals usually come from strengths to build on, weaknesses to be strengthened, opportunities to be taken, and threats to be avoided. Next slide. Looked at in relation to an organization's life cycle, as organizations change and grow from startup phase to growth phase through governance phase and onto the institutional phase, they develop certain characteristics which can be both positive and negative and require different management and leadership abilities. Based on information identified in the SILC organizational snapshot and personal experience related to the council members, the group is encouraged to generate a list of up to 5 to 10 items per SWOT area. Just be creative. Whoever is facilitating, you certainly, 10 is more than enough. 5 is a good number. You certainly want to get people involved. But, we're talking about what strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Next slide. Strengths could be your committee structure is strong and functional. You conduct really good studies, surveys, and reports. Opportunities, you want to maximize use of your website. Maybe previously access ERA funds to replace outdated IT. Now you're probably looking to tap into I&E funds to replace your IT. Weaknesses, lack of resources, IT infrastructure outdated, something maybe you try to replace every 5 years. And notice how sometimes you have your opportunities and your weaknesses are opposite one another with the IT. Threats, lack of funding diversity, state or federal budget cuts. The point is, you decide and you prioritize. Next slide. Exercise number 3, it's Drucker Worksheet 1. What is your current mission statement? Does the mission statement need to be replaced? Maybe, maybe not. New mission statement? Well, you take some time to create it. And this can be very challenging for anyone who's ever gone through this process. Mission guidelines, purpose of the organization, who you are and what you do. It can take time to achieve this, an hour plus. Needs to be facilitated, like Ann was saying earlier. You can get a consultant or someone maybe from your network who is really good at facilitating. Sometimes it's beneficial to have someone who's just a really good consultant, a facilitator in the process. Sometimes it's even a little beneficial to have someone who's a little bit somewhat knowledgeable about the network and or who you are a little bit. Sometimes not. But they definitely have to be a really good facilitator and know the process. Next slide. Exercise number 4, Drucker Worksheet 1A. What is the current vision statement? Does the vision statement need to be replaced? Again, maybe, maybe not. New vision statement, you got to get to it. You got to create it, modify it. Vision statement elements. It's more comprehensive. It's compelling, global, inspires commitment and action. Same aspects apply, to the vision statement. It takes time. It has to be facilitated. A lot of work and effort. Next slide. I'm going to call this exercise number 5, and it's actually Drucker Worksheet 5. And everyone has a customer. Okay, you could be selling widgets, ideas, or bread, but everyone has a customer. You need to identify your primary customer. And you're going to be identifying that customer and reassessing who your primary customer is. We can say that a consumer is a SILC's primary customer, but just who is a SILC's primary customer? This will take some thought and discussion. I know for us it took us a bit. Turned out to be New Yorkers with disabilities. I remember getting hung up, was it New Yorkers with disabilities? Was it New Yorkers with disabilities who comment on the state plan? No, you can't say that. But this is what you're going to get engaged in. But you have to determine who your primary customer is. Then you identify your supporting customers. It may include volunteers, members, former members, state plan partners, funders, and other stakeholders. It is very important. Any entity, any business needs to know who their customers are. Next slide. I'm going to call this exercise 6, and it's Drucker Worksheet 15. The top 5 priority goals. Now, we could do a full-blown strategic plan, but we're going to merge and modify. So let's identify goals based on top priorities from the SILC snapshot, the SWOT analysis, external input, consistent with mission and vision. Assign responsibility of each goal to appropriate council committee. I love to do work by committee. Have the committee work on action steps to facilitate progress on the goal. And, I didn't put this in there, but you should identify connection to any of your customers, right? When relevant. Identify, like I said, the potential resources if appropriate, and identify a time frame, up to 5 years. This is your plan. I think you can create this priority strategic plan that is going to be important for you. What you need to do. I think, this is going to be spot on, and you can connect it to your committee structure and what's going to be vital for your needs as a SILC. Next slide. Outcomes of strategic planning. Clear picture of your organization from the inside out. Updated mission and vision statements, usually. Identified customers and organizational needs. Clear goals to work toward with action steps to achieve progress. Be sure to include newly defined SILC areas under WIOA. A stronger, more productive SILC. Next slide. Resources. Well, I've listed 3 items: a link to a free SWOT analysis template, and a link to the Drucker Foundation website, notation to the self-assessment tool that I'm familiar with, and then last, a link to the SILC snapshot via the ILRU website, a courtesy because Western New York Independent Living had the ROTC and IL management a few cycles ago, so I don't think that that's actively on their site anymore. So I very much appreciate ILRU putting the snapshot up for people to have access to. But those are the resources. Next slide.
Okay, this is the final Q&A break. So we had gotten a question about the snapshot, and I too appreciate that ILRU was willing to post that, along with those other resources. So check those out for sure. But let's go ahead and see if we have any other questions for Brad and Ann. And Velja is wondering, Ann, if the DSE is responsible for funding the SILC.
Okay, that's a very good question. Within WIOA, there is parameters that say the Part B dollars may be used to fund a SILC, but only up to 30% of the Part B dollars. Now, there's a possible way around that if the centers in the SILC agree that it needs to be more than 30%, and they put it in the state plan and explain why, then it can be more than 30%. But a really interesting thing in WIOA is that the piece in Title I, the rehab part of WIOA, that deals with innovation and expansion funds and says, the language says that they shall use a portion of those innovation and expansion funds to fund the SILC, is still in there. So under federal law, the DSU that you have now is supposed to continue to have responsibility for providing I&E funding to fund the resource plan of the SILC. The DSE that you select does not have responsibility for funding the SILC. They will have responsibility for receiving the Part B dollars and distributing them according to what the SPIL says they're supposed to be used for. So it's real interesting how that's playing out. Now remember, you also have a new authorized activity that is resource development. And so you are not only allowed, but you have full authority under the law to do resource development to generate additional funding to support SILC activities. I hope that answers your question.
Great. Thanks, Ann.
Mm-hmm.
I had a couple of quick questions. I know we have to wait for the new regs, but what if your state, it's a twofold question, what if your state is actually in a situation where you need to develop a significant revision to the plan right now?
That's also a very good question. I will tell you that.
I could answer that very practically.
Go for it.
Well, we, in New York, we had some issues with our state plan, process which happened near the end, okay? And rather than test the 3 issues, and of course, you know, it was kind of an expedited, when was it, like September 19th or so, and that's what we were told it had to be in. You know, we let it go, and we said we would address our issues post-SPIL. Well, it was good hindsight because then, of course, the government shutdown happened, et cetera, et cetera. We then did letters and correspondence with our post-SPIL issues, which brought us right into an RSA determination letter for our current SPIL, you know, 14 through 16, right, for which we had to do some technical edits for the issues that we addressed, okay, but without the need for public input or hearing, okay, and I'm literally doing and getting the clearance for the edits on the RSA MIS now. All right? So I'm still doing it now.
Okay, but you're talking about minor technical. This is significant in terms of reallocation.
Okay, all right. So
of
I guess
a significant amount of money. So
having to do hearings and public input and edit.
Okay. Again, it's a twofold question. How do we go about that? When, in order to do all of the things that we're talking about on the phone, it would be very helpful to be able to utilize our staff. However, the current DSU has advised us that they have the authority to hire our staff. So that's one of the things we're trying to get clear in the state plan, but we can't use the staff to address all these new responsibilities if the current DSU says we, the DSU, have the authority to select your staff, to hire your new staff person. So we're kind of between a rock and a hard place.
Well, hopefully that rock is going to move soon.
Well, hopefully. That's why I was hoping to get some help on the call because, you know, for example, you talked earlier about the fact that, you know, there has to be some discussion between the SILC members and the centers about who you want as your DSC. We can't even get to that point.
Right.
Because there's a new, you know, our executive director retired, and so we wanted to put out, you know, opportunities to hire a new one. And the current DSU said, no, we're going to issue a contract, and we are going to hire the person as we, the DSU, and we're in the new, you know, it's after October 1st. We kind of feel like we should be directing the activities of our staff to do all these different things that we're talking about on the call today. So
well, under the law, before WIOA passed, and under WIOA, the SILC is supposed to be able to supervise its own staff.
Right. We understand. Well, here's the problem. The law says supervise, and here's what the state is using, our state. It doesn't say hire. It says monitor and evaluate. It doesn't say hire. Just.
Well, you're unfortunately in a bad time of trying to deal with this.
Right,
because
exactly.
Currently, there is a MOU between the Administration on Community Living and the Rehabilitation Services Administration for RSA to continue to administer the program until it transitions.
Right. It's a difficult time all the way around. But for us in particular, yes. We were just hoping to get some additional, I don't know, suggestions or guidance, because all of these objectives that we're discussing today are things that the SILC wants to begin working on, but we can't really do it without, you know, the assistance that we need.
Right. And if you're wanting to amend your state plan to address those new things you're allowed to do.
That's a part of it. Yeah, it's a part of it. Also reallocation.
I wouldn't try to do that yet. If you have a specific...
One thing you could do is couldn't you have like forums, or couldn't you have dialogues, or couldn't you collect information in terms of some of the things that you would like to do, so that you wouldn't have to wait, so you would have the information?
The problem is if the current state unit is going to hire the employee and direct the activities of the employee, we're kind of trying to do that on our own. And as to modifying the state plan or revising the state plan, we're talking about a change of about $400,000 in funds and where it's going, and that's why we felt it was necessary to have the public hearings. But I hear you. We could do all those things, but we can't do them if we don't have access. I mean, our SILC chair didn't even get information about this training, today's training. She's not getting any of the NICL, you know, the state council is a member of NICL, but you know, not even all that information is going to the DSU. So, and I know it's not the focus of the discussion. I understand that. It's just we thought, you know, maybe when we talk about what we're supposed to do, somebody might have an idea on how we could actually be able to do that.
And there's no big secret yet. It's not like somebody else knows how to do this and you don't.
No, we just thought you guys might have some insight, you know. That
Sure.
You know.
I mean, you can try to write an amendment to your state plan and send it in, but your DSU has to sign it at this point in time.
That's what I'm confused. That's exactly my question.
Because it's the existing state plan. See what I mean? And it has to go to RSA, so I don't expect that they're going to
Oh,
all
so
of
the
a sudden say,
DSE thing doesn't kick in until it's actually time for a whole new state plan. Okay.
or
Not a revision.
Yeah, right. Because you don't have a DSE yet, and we don't know what the process is yet.
Okay, that helps. I mean, that clarifies a little bit for us. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mary is asking about the remaining 70% of Title VII Part B funds allocated after the 30% for the SILC. Mary asks, has an amount been allocated of the innovation and expansion funds?
This is all things that you're going to have to decide as you develop your state plan. Obviously, if you've been getting innovation and expansion funds and you want to continue to do that, you're going to have to negotiate that with your current DSU, your VR agency. The 30%, 70% is what the law says. It's the maximum of 30% can be used for the SILC. There also can be 5% used by the designated state entity for administrative costs. But you'll have to outline all that in your state plan. So you can use the 70% of the Title VII Part B funds for any of the uses that are authorized in the law, and there's a lot. You can fund a center for independent living. You can give money to all the centers to provide specific programs. You can fund independent living services. There's a lot of things you can do with that money, but that'll all be part of your state plan development process for you all to all sit down together and decide after you have heard from people with disabilities around your state about what their needs are. Then you sit down and decide, okay, this is how much money we have, what can we accomplish with this, and how do we want to allocate it for what purposes.
Okay, thanks, Ann. And again, I know everyone is really hungry for this information on WIOA, so I know you heard us say it, but just a reminder that coming up on Tuesday for NICL members, NICL's having a call on everything we know at this point, and just trust whether it's through NICL or through the ILNet project among NICL, ILRU, and April over the course of the next year. As soon as we learn more information, we'll share it with you all via emails, trainings like this, etc. So, and don't forget, in the meantime, you can always send us questions. That's what we're here for at NICL, and that's a big role of the ILNet project too, is to answer questions like this. So we're happy to take those questions anytime.
Tim, if people didn't receive the announcement about that training directly, can they access it on the NICL website?
Of course. Yeah, so that's on the NICL website. And if any of you didn't receive that announcement or are concerned you aren't getting training announcements from ILNet or communications from NICL, of course you can reach out to me. I'm at tim@ncil.org. That's tim@ncil.org. And I'll be happy to make sure that gets corrected right away. We want to make sure that you all are hearing from us on both the ILNet project and NICL's communications. Okay, still don't see any additional questions. So I'm going to take about 2 minutes to wrap up here. So if you have more questions, don't be shy. We've got time before we close. But I'm going to go ahead to the next slide, 33, where Brad and Ann have been generous enough to provide their contact information. Thanks, you all. So their phone and email addresses are here. And as I mentioned, my email is simple. It's just tim@ncil.org. So whether you have a content-related question and you don't have Ann and Brad's information handy, or whether you have a question about the program, don't hesitate to reach out to me, whether it's later this afternoon or 6 months from now. We'd love to hear from you all. Here on slide 34, wrap up and evaluation. This is the link to the evaluation form that I mentioned. So please do fill that out so that we know what you thought of today's call. And as promised, it looks like we have one more question that's coming on the phone. So let's go to that since we have time.
I'm wondering if there's common goals or if the goals are only as per customers only. Is there a list or an example of common goals?
No, that's a very good question, and I think the way that we have worked with it is you get to customize and prioritize your goals. And I'll give you an example, and I'm glad you asked this question, because like a strategic plan is only as good as you make it, and then if it like sits in a computer file and it doesn't get engaged, then and people don't revisit it or check it out, or if it doesn't get activated by the committee and you don't look at it, and people in your council isn't active in making folks accountable to it, then it's really not a plan. It's just a concept, a paper. So it's only as good as you end up making it and try to engage people in making it happen. So for instance, we chose, I'll give you examples, updating our technology, all right, which we successfully did. And we're updating it now and getting our technology, and we're getting a new web platform. Or if you actually visit our web platform right now, it looks really old. It's going to get updated. So, I mean, that's like one. We realized that we needed to increase our visibility. I mean, that's a nebulous one, but that was one that we identified, and we needed to do some branding. We needed to do some public relations, and with the IT, we needed to get that out there. And who is the New York State Independent Living Council? And not only branding out there, but then it had to deal with relationships. Remember, customers, primary and supporting customers? We needed to get out there and start developing our relationships. And these were parts of our goal. And part of that is who you then start doing work with and making relationships with. And that's what we chose. Remember how I said it's all based on your need and your strengths, opportunities, weaknesses, threats. It's what you decide. What you decide is important. And so then you decide. It can be something like that, okay? And it could be something related, and it was something related to resources too, which, in our SILCdom, we had to do in a very, we developed a committee, okay? Our committee of SILC members are volunteers. They can work on the issue. We can identify ideas. As staff, of course, we can only address it as individual people who, at home can address it, but, when it comes to actual resource development, can't do it at the office. That's going to change with RIOA, but that's how we addressed it in the previous. We're about to do this new cycle, but I'm glad you asked that, because the plan is only as good as you make it and then carry it out, and then the goals can be as specific and as to what you want to make them, and they can be to things like visibility and like relationships, because they can be the most important things for you in your council, but they might not be the most important thing for another council. Does that answer your question?
Yes, very much.
All right, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Brad. Okay. I'll continue to wrap up here. So basically, the only thing left to say is I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us today. Don't forget that these presentations are all archived on ILRU's website. That's at ilru.org. You can go to training in the menu bar and then select on-demand training, and you'll see the archive of this webinar within 48 hours at the end of the call, probably sooner. And so you can share that with colleagues at your organization, at the SILC, on your council, or at SILs within your state if you want them to be able to see the presentation that you saw today. So anyhow, I want to thank all of you for being with us today. Brad and Ann, an excellent job. Thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate your time preparing the presentation and talking with everyone today. Again, don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have follow-up questions or if you're not getting announcements from us. We want to make sure that you're in the loop. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.